Well, welcome everybody, and here we are for parts 3 and parts 4 of the new history of the human race. And we're much more closely related than we really think we are. We're with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. Dr. Jeanson has a PhD in biology from Harvard University, and we've already done parts 1 and parts 2 of this human history, the new history of the human race. Actually, Dr. Jeanson is rewriting human history. How about that? Now, of course, he's not rewriting the Bible, he's rewriting secular history, so to speak, and showing that a true understanding of history actually confirms the Bible. And so, okay, so Dr. Jeanson, what's the title of today's presentation and what's the title of the next one, parts 3 and parts 4?
I'm calling today's presentation really a question. Were the ancient Persians black? And by black, I mean that in quotation marks. Were they dark-skinned peoples? Do they look like Africans? And then in our part 4, we're going to be discussing the topic, how to silently take over a country. And both of these deal heavily with how ethnicities can change, because there's certain things we take for granted. And our heavy focus, again, will be what happened after Babel. We tend to think, if we're as creationists, lots of ethnic change was the result of Babel. That's true. But what happened thereafter, and could there have been ethnic change very recently? So these are the main focuses that we're going to be on today.
And I think we just need to also say to people, just remind them, you said black in quotes. So when we say black and white, we really mean dark brown and light brown, so to speak, in a sense.
Yeah.
Because we all have the same basic pigment. But black and white for the sake of people understanding the groups, the cultures you're talking about.
Exactly.
So, okay, so were the ancient Persians black, in quotes? Take it away for us.
Now we'll do our favorite experiment with screen sharing to see if it works. Okay. New history of the human race, stuff you won't find anywhere else except here. So we hope you'll join us for each of these episodes. We've got many planned. The big question we're trying to focus on is the question of who we came from. What are the relationships among the people groups that we see today that we often think of as different, separate, hard to be connected to because their practices and cultures are so different? But we know from the Bible there's a lot of connections among us. And now with genetics, we can drill down to the step-by-step genealogical connections between us. And this allows us not only to look at present-day peoples, but to go back in history and say, what is the relationship between the ancient Persians and, let's say, the modern people of Iran, or the ancient pharaohs and modern Egyptians? Could any of these people be in our family tree? Who do we come from? We've mentioned last week some of the shocking things we'll be discovering are that so-called black white people exist. And again, I put that in quotes because we're all various shades of brown. But there are people, we'll discover there are people, Caucasian peoples out there, light-skinned peoples who have had dark-skinned ancestors from Africa for thousands of years. And even probably some white supremacists in this group who go around arguing for a position that they can't even justify with genetics, let alone with anything ethical. So there's some big shocks in store there. We'll see that many Europeans are of recent Asian ancestry. So I'm familiar with European nationalism and being proud of one's heritage. We'll find out genetically a lot of these national identities go back to Asia in the recent past. And a lot of these European nationalities disappear genetically. They're all connected. We'll see revolutionary things in history. We'll see that in the Americas, before Columbus, there was a resettling event. People came in, took over from those who were here before. And this is all before Europeans arrived. So this is a dramatic rewrite to how the mainstream community understands the pre-Columbian history of the Americas. We'll also
By the way,
go back to
Dr. Jeanson, before you go on there, this would also have political ramifications too, wouldn't it, in our current world?
Very much so. There's some politically incorrect things here, but we'll handle it very gently and carefully and think through what this means practically. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg, because we'll find out there's connections between Native Americans and Europeans that are closer than between certain Europeans and other Europeans. So genetics takes a sledgehammer to most of what we've held dear and for granted and rewrites this in a very revolutionary way. We'll also go back to the most ancient times. Our approach is going to take a present day, going back in time to the earliest history approach, sort of from front to back. And we'll eventually cover those fascinating ancient mysteries of who are the Neanderthals, where did they come from, what happened to them, are we connected to them? And we'll find out that some of these Neanderthals were not in any sense primitive, but likely survivors of ancient catastrophes. And the overall goal, of course, is that all of us can look at our own histories, the histories of those we love, our own stories, and marvel at them in a way we've never marveled at before, because these ideas are so revolutionary. In episode 1, we saw that the world is smaller than we think. We all know that everyone comes from somebody, but the number of somebodies in the past was a lot smaller than what we see today. Even just a few hundred years ago, there was 20 times fewer people in the globe than there are today. And so practically what that means is, if you're looking for a spouse back then, there's a lot fewer options. So either you have to marry someone who's a closer relative than maybe we might be comfortable with marrying, or you marry outside of your group, which is going to connect people groups of the world more than we think. We also in episode 2 looked at the math of our family trees. If you go back each generation, your number of ancestors doubles. And you can't do that indefinitely. You go back just a few hundred years and you've got more ancestors in theory than there are people on the planet. So how do you solve this math problem? You have to connect the branches of your family tree. Your parents are more related to each other than you think. You are more related to your spouse than you think. The French are probably British and vice versa. That's one of the specific questions we focused on in that episode. And in our next 2 episodes, we're going to look through some of the implications of this. We ended that episode saying this seems to imply that there's a lot more connections among very different ethnic groups than we think. It almost implies that ethnicities have changed in the recent past, that Africans are now Europeans, or Europeans Africans, or something along those lines. So to explore this in more depth, what we want to consider today is the question of, were the ancient Persians black or dark skinned? Were they dark brown? We have carvings from the modern day Iranian area and in Middle East. Here's one of the carvings. You can see their nose shape, eye shape, the type of hair they have. Doesn't really tell you the skin tone per se. And there's questions you can ask, such as, is that curly hair cosmetic, or is that curly hair genetic? Is that due to some sort of African influence? If you're like me, you tend to assume, well, to figure out what the ancients look like, you just look at their modern descendants. For example, the modern Iranians. What do modern Iranians look like? Here's an image that I find fascinating, because this is one we got from Getty Images, and it says this, in this image, there is a Iranian tour guide and a Western tourist. And I'm curious how many of our viewers can figure out which one is which. My wife pointed out that if you can see in the lower left part of the screen, there's a bag with sunglasses, so obviously things that tourists take with them. But who does it belong to? Look at the features of these 2 ladies. There isn't that much that distinguishes them, and quite frankly, I don't know which is which, and that's the point. These 2 ladies have very similar ethnic features. Modern Iranians have strong resemblance to European peoples, especially the European peoples of the Mediterranean, Spanish, Italians, Greek, and so forth. Well, the ancient Persian Empire, when it reached one of its greatest extents, covered not only modern Iran. You can see in the east there it touches India. You can see that it stretches through the Middle East, modern Iraq, Israel, Turkey. It even goes into southern Europe there, the Balkan Peninsula with Greece. You can see it touches North Africa and Egypt. So if it touches North Africa, is there a chance there was African influence? Could they have come from Africans? Could they have looked very different from the modern Iranians? Is there a disconnect there? To answer that big picture historical question, I'm going to bring it home and think about the ancestry of my own wife. She's obviously pale-skinned, she'll say, light brown. Her parents are light-skinned like she, Caucasians. Her parents, though, both have straight hair. They're of Scotch, Irish, or Welsh descent. And my wife has naturally curly hair, so curly she likes to joke about on humid days having an afro. And in a more serious sense, when she had a haircut recently, the beautician asked, in all seriousness, whether my wife was of mixed ethnic ancestry. She wondered if she had African in her blood because of the curliness of her hair. So how would you answer that question? Is it possible that my wife, despite being very fair-skinned, has a dark-skinned ancestor. And of course, being in the Americas, the sad history of dark-skinned peoples here is the slave trade. So is it possible that there was perhaps a former slave in my wife's family tree? So this sort of question is one, of course, we get frequently in Answers in Genesis, but primarily in the context of where do the various ethnic groups come from, and we tend to answer it rightly by pointing to God's confusion of the languages at the Tower of Babel, which forces people to spread out, and they take various genetics with them. And so I'm going to think about that question. If you've followed our ministry for a while, what I'm going to discuss is probably familiar, and then we're going to give it a new twist. We're going to apply it to something much more recent, my wife's ancestry, my own ancestry, to see if there could be recent ethnic change in our family trees, and of course the principles then apply to you. And we'll bring it back around to the ancient Persians. To oversimplify the genetics of skin tone, because it's complex, we want to keep the discussion simple. We're just going to use high school genetics and talk about genetics in terms of uppercase letters and lowercase letters. So uppercase letters will say represent the genetics for dark skin, lowercase letters the genetics for light skin. So if someone like my wife's parents is light skin, we can say, well, they must have all lowercase letters. They'd be of a light brown skin tone. That's the genetics. And if you use a Punnett square to say, well, what would their descendants look like? What sort of children could they produce? What does the DNA encode? You'll see that all they can produce is children with more lowercase letters, which means that I'll be light-skinned. So big surprise there. Light-skinned people produce more light-skinned offspring. The same type of scenario works with dark-skinned peoples. For those of dark brown skin, they've got all capital letters. So to figure out what sort of offspring they could produce, you'd use the Punnett square again. And once again, you find that dark-skinned people produce children of dark-skinned genetics. No surprise there. And if you followed our ministry, you know that what we've often emphasized, very rightly, is that if you have ancestors of a mixed genetic makeup, some uppercase letters, some lowercase letters, naturally this would mean that they are of a middle brown skin tone, you get some really surprising results. It's not surprising for those who've studied genetics, but it's surprising to our intuition. We're not used to thinking in these terms. So two parents who have a mix of uppercase letters and lowercase letters can produce a whole mix of shades of skin in one generation. They have tremendous genetic potential and can produce all the various shades you see here. So you'll notice that this particular Punnett square has 16 boxes. Most people don't have 16 children, though we have some of our colleagues, of course, at Answers in Genesis who are seemingly trying to get there. I have 4. This type of potential exists in these people. And an example, a more tangible example of what this type of person might look like, comes from families today in which one of the parents is of one ethnicity, let's say light skin, and one is of darker skin, a different ethnicity. Their children, basically by definition, are going to be of a mixed genetic makeup. The children shown here, you see, are of a skin tone between that of their parents, and they're going to have a mix of these uppercase and lowercase letters. So if you have Adam and Eve, who have this sort of genetic makeup, if you have Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives, who have this sort of genetic makeup, if you have this sort of potential at the start of the humanity, at the beginning in creation, or after the flood with Noah and his family and at Babel, you have the potential to produce every type of ethnicity known to man. And so the confusion of languages will result in the separation of peoples. They'll take some of the subsets of genetic with them and spread out.
So,
That's all.
Dr. Jeanson, before you go on here, have you ever thought about what Adam and Eve might have looked like?
Yes, and we'll probably have a whole episode dedicated to what they would have looked like genetically, practically, what their children would have looked like, and dive into this question to get a sense for and try to recreate the earliest stages of human history.
That would be great. That's something to look forward to in one of the future ones.
Yes, very much so. We'll get back to the beginning and all those really interesting questions.
Well, great.
I want to apply it to a very simple modern scenario. So I've discussed my wife. Let me change that question once more. So we've already got maybe some indirect evidence that she might have a dark-skinned ancestor given her hair tone. What about me? I've got straight hair, light skin. Both my parents have straight hair, light skinned. Is there any chance that in the recent past, I might have a dark-skinned ancestor? And I'm going to think this through with the genetics we just discussed, but again, apply them in a new way that perhaps people aren't used to thinking about. So because I'm light-skinned, presumably the rest of the members of my family tree would also be light-skinned. And I'm asking the question, could there be one of the branches that has a dark-skinned person? We want to explore this particular hypothesis, scenario. So let's begin with the next generation, looking at this union right here, this dark-skinned man, presumably because he's in my family tree, his spouse would be light-skinned. What would their offspring look like? And essentially, it's similar to the image of that family we just saw. You have someone with all capital letters, dark-skinned person, marrying someone of all lowercase letters, they're light-skinned. What would their children look like? Well, mom can only pass on the information for light skin, dad only the information for dark skin. And so all of their children will be middle brown, a mix of uppercase letters and lowercase letters. And again, it's like the child we just observed of a skin tone in between her parents. So that's the next generation. We can derive what they would have looked like. They would have been middle brown. They have a mix of genetic letters. Let's take it now one generation further to see what happens. So now we're talking about this generation. We've already derived what the husband would look like, middle brown skin, uppercase letters and lowercase letters. What about the wife? Well, again, in my family tree, I've said there's presumably most of the people are of light skin. And so his spouse on this family tree would again be of light skin, all lowercase letters. So this middle brown individual marries a light-skinned individual. There's their genetic makeup. Use the Punnett square to figure out what those children look like. You can fill in these 16 boxes here. And what you see is that there are a range of skin tones. So it's not quite as extreme in terms of the potential as two people of middle brown skin marry, but there's still a variety that's present here. On the left, you've got middle brown skin and it gets progressively lighter to the right side. 50% of the children, though, the highest probability is to have a slightly lighter brown skin tone, one capital letter and three lowercase letters. So I'm going to take this person as the most likely outcome of that union. Let's now take it the next generation further, down to here. So I've said we're now at a lighter skin tone, not light like me, but lighter than middle brown. They've got one capital letter, three lowercase letters. Who are they going to marry? On this side of the tree, you again have light-skinned people. So spouse again is light-skinned, but the other side of the family tree of this union is a little bit darker skin. If you do the Punnett square here and figure out what their offspring would have looked like, you'll see that you basically have two possibilities. Half the children will be all light-skinned, half will be just a little bit darker. So in just a few generations, you can see that we go from a very dark-skinned person to someone whose skin is as light as mine. So basic genetics tells us that it's entirely possible, even though I have straight hair, typical Caucasian features, just a few generations ago, I may have had a dark-skinned ancestor. So just to see what this looks like generation to generation, let's watch what happens in sort of fast forward at each branch of this family tree, each generation. So this gentleman, dark-skinned, presumably each of his parents were dark-skinned, so that's what he would look like. He'd be one of these boxes here. But then he marries a light-skinned individual, so the next generation is middle brown, and you keep at each generation getting lighter and lighter, so that in 4 to 5 generations, you have a high chance of being entirely light-skinned. So could it be possible that my wife with her curly hair does have a dark-skinned ancestor? Yes, she can be light-skinned, yet still just a few generations ago have a dark-skinned ancestor. You might say, well, why does she have curly hair? That's where the complexity of genetics comes into play. We've oversimplified skin tone, but the basic principles apply to skin tone, hair type, hair shape, hair color, cheekbone position, nose type, mouth, so forth. Virtually every type of feature that defines our typical ethnicities that we take for granted, you can mix and match them left and right, and it's all probabilities. What I've shown here is the most likely outcome, but you can have a person who has a dark-skinned ancestor, and in a few generations they're light-skinned, but somehow the information for curl still slips through. Again, I've shown you Punnett squares where you're talking about frequencies in terms of 16 children. Most people don't have 16 children, so each generation there's a little bit of, some people might say chance, we'd say God's providence. There's things that can get mixed up and passed on in ways you don't expect. What about the ancient Persians, though? Well, we can begin to answer this question by looking at their modern descendants and applying the same genetics we just discussed. Either of these ladies, based on the genetics we discussed, can have a dark-skinned ancestor just a few generations ago. So you don't even need to go back to the ancient Persians to invoke the possibility of a dark-skinned person. an African descent person. They can produce light-skinned offspring in just a few generations. So based on basic genetics, it's theoretically possible that this curly hair is not cosmetic, it's due to African influence. Virtually anything is possible from a genetic perspective when you think about the ancients. So let's ask an even crazier question. If the modern Iranians could theoretically have dark-skinned peoples as their ancestors, what about all of Europe? Is it possible that all of Europe is of recent African descent? That sounds wild and crazy. It won't be quite so wild and crazy in our next episode. It all depends on the numbers. We'll cover that then. What I want our readers, our viewers to see today is that racial or ethnic change happens a whole lot faster than we think. So when we look at the evidence we discussed in previous episodes, that family trees are more connected, the world is smaller than we connected, there's a whole lot more possibility for ethnic change than we're used to thinking about. You might be like me, grew up thinking, well, ethnicities arose after Babel, and they've been mostly fixed ever since. Looking at the genetics, there's a lot more possibility than we're used to thinking about, which means we're probably a lot more connected than we think, and our relationships to the ancients take on a whole new meaning and a whole new set of possibilities. This is the new history of the human race, and I hope our viewers will join us again as we continue to dig into this question of who we came from, how we got here, and what our relationship is to these ancient peoples.
Well, Dr. Jeanson, this is really absolutely fascinating. People love history, you know, and when you look at human populations, I mean, people are so indoctrinated with evolutionary ideas. That's what I find. And because they're so indoctrinated with evolutionary ideas, we've got this sort of idea that it takes, ages, hundreds of thousands or millions of years for these changes to happen. In fact, if you think about that, isn't that true when it comes to animals? Like we would say that two of each kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing animal got on board Noah's Ark, and that was 4,300 years ago. And so when you look at all the different horse species today, the camel species, and so it goes on, they all formed within 4,300 years because the genetic potential was already there that God put in there. And so they were able to, get all these different combinations and so on very quickly after the flood. Evolutionists have to believe somehow that new information is generated somehow by chance random processes. And the same would be true of the way they think about humans as well, wouldn't they, as they evolve? Would that be correct?
Yeah, and it's a good point. Even though we might grow up believing the Bible and imbibing what Scripture says, we're surrounded and living in a culture that's immersed in evolution, and it's difficult to not adopt an underlying assumption, a feeling of, well, it just takes a long time. We came out of Africa, and Africans have been that way forever, and Europeans have been that way forever, and no, history is much more compressed than we think, and the potential for ethnic change is much greater than we think. And the same principles then apply to the animal world as well. You take a few kinds on board the ark, and boom, in a few generations, you can produce a whole host of diversity using the similar principles we've just discussed.
And see, that's the thing that really hit me as you were talking. And, we've been battling this for years now, dealing with the creation evolution issue and speciation and adaptation and so on, and showing that, no, this can happen quickly and you don't need the hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And we can show you genetically how it happens. Well, now you're saying, listen, we need to rethink the whole human race as well from this same sort of perspective. All these changes can happen so quickly. I mean, we sort of think about, Tower of Babel after the flood and so on. But what you're doing is really radically changing how we think about all these different people groups, because I think even the best of us can think, that must have taken a long time. But that's just not necessarily true. And I think that's one of the things you're really challenging us with here.
I think part of the psychology of all this as well is, even though 4 to 5 generations is a short amount of time, we live for one generation. And whether we like it or not, we tend to believe what we see. And if we don't see dramatic ethnic change happening, or we say, well, we're in a modern era, the US is a melting pot. Surely history has never been a melting pot. This is the result of modern technology. We form these underlying assumptions based on what we see and then adopt it without knowing it. And then when you look at, no, what's actually possible, it destroys all the stereotypes we've adopted without even thinking about it.
Which is one of the challenges we have to people, and that is, God's given us a history book. That history book is true, And when you take that history book and then you build your worldview on that, then you go and look at the evidence, it all starts to make sense. And it overwhelmingly confirms or corroborates, or whatever you want to say, the word of God. And that's true when it comes to archaeological evidence as well. You know, you got to, people think in terms of these long times, and then they go out and try to interpret archaeology and they say, no, this doesn't fit with the Bible and so on, but they're looking in the wrong places because they got the wrong time frame. And
we'll discover as these episodes go along, the hero of the plot comes from a very unlikely source, unlikely from a mainstream perspective. And it's really going to challenge the cultural idols that people worship and want to keep in their positions of adoration and can't touch it.
Well, that's absolutely phenomenal. So during this whole coronavirus situation, we're doing a lot of Facebook Lives, and we have been doing this series with you. And this is part 3. Part 4 will be tomorrow afternoon, or tomorrow night, I should say, at 7 p.m. That's Sunday night. And because we're going to archive all these too. If people want to go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, all this series will be archived there. So if you missed part 1 and part 2, you can go and have a look at those. And then you can let people know that they'll all be archived there. This is part 3. So real quickly, one sentence. Part 4, tomorrow night, what's it going to be?
We're going to look at this question of how to silently take over a country and whether or not it's possible that most Europeans could be of recent African descent. It sounds radical, but once you run the numbers, what sounds radical is going to really alter our stereotypical assumptions and expand our view of history.
So we're going to take over, how to take over a country. You sound like a revolutionary now.
Exactly. It's revolutionary ideas.
Exactly. Revolutionary ideas when it comes to history. Okay. Well, thanks, Dr. Jeanson. And we will be back for part 4. Can't wait.